In the autumn of 480 BC, one of the most decisive naval confrontations in recorded history was on the verge of taking place in the tight sea passages near the coast of Salamis, Greece. A massive fleet of warships, thousands of soldiers, and the future direction of Western civilization all seemed to hang in the dense, salt-filled air above the water. Among the many commanders steering their vessels into that unfolding chaos was someone no one had anticipated. A woman, not a legend, not a symbolic figure, but a real, living queen who had secured her authority among the admirals of the most powerful empire of the ancient world. Her name was Artemisia. What she would do on that brutal morning, drenched in blood and uncertainty, would echo through more than 2 millennia of debate and remembrance. To truly grasp who Artemisia was, we first need to understand the world that shaped her existence. The Mediterranean of the 5th century BC was a place of restless energy, ambition, warfare, trade, and constant transformation. It was far from a peaceful age. Instead, it was a time when civilizations collided, when ideas clashed, and when entirely new ways of organizing human societies were emerging, forms that had never existed before and would never reappear in quite the same shape again. The ancient Mediterranean was not a single unified realm, but rather a patchwork of interconnected cultures pressed together around a shared sea. On its eastern edge stood the enormous Persian Empire, the largest political structure the world had yet seen. On the western side were the Greek city-states, small, often divided, frequently at war with each other, yet collectively beginning to develop a revolutionary idea that ordinary citizens, not only kings, could influence the fate of their cities. These two worlds observed each other across the Aegean Sea with a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and unease. The Greeks labeled all outsiders barbaros, originally meaning those who spoke foreign tongues, but over time it evolved into a term carrying disdain and superiority. The Persians, meanwhile, viewed the Greeks as quarrelsome and fragmented mountain communities, difficult to control, perhaps, but ultimately insignificant in the grand scale of imperial ambition. Yet for a brief and extraordinary moment in history, these two civilizations would collide directly. From that collision would emerge legendary battles, influential ideas, and remarkable individuals whose names would survive far beyond their own time. Artemisia of Halicarnassus was one of those figures. But before following her onto the waters of Salamis, we must first understand the vast historical machinery that placed her there. We must travel back to the origins of the Persian Empire itself. The Persian Empire did not begin as a vast imperial power. It began as a relatively modest kingdom in the region of Anshan in what is now southwestern Iran. For a time, it might have remained a minor regional state if not for the rise of a single extraordinary ruler, Cyrus. Cyrus the Great, as later generations would call him, was a conqueror of immense vision and, by ancient standards, unusual restraint. His approach was not merely to destroy and replace, but to absorb and integrate. In the mid-6th century BC, he launched a series of campaigns that reshaped the political landscape of the Near East. He overthrew the Median Empire that had previously dominated neighboring regions. He defeated Croesus, the famously wealthy king of Lydia, whose name became synonymous with riches. He then advanced into Mesopotamia, capturing the ancient city of Babylon in 539 BC with surprisingly little resistance. The city's inhabitants, exhausted by poor leadership, reportedly welcomed him as a liberator rather than a conqueror. What Cyrus created was more than a territory-spanning empire. It was an administrative system designed to manage diversity on an unprecedented scale. The Persians recognized that ruling over vast populations speaking different languages, practicing different religions, and following different customs could not be achieved through force alone. Stability required structure, flexibility, and local cooperation. From this understanding emerged the system of satrapies. A satrap was a provincial governor, often drawn from local elites or trusted Persian nobles, who governed regions in the king's name while allowing many local traditions to continue unchanged. This balance between central authority and regional autonomy helped the empire endure across generations. Under Cyrus's successor Cambyses, Egypt was absorbed into the empire. Under Darius the Great, expansion continued even further, eastward into the Indus Valley, northward towards Central Asia steppe regions, and westward toward the edges of Europe. By the time Darius focused his attention on the Greek world, the Persian Empire spanned 3 continents and ruled over millions of people speaking countless languages, all under the authority of a single imperial throne. Yet it was in the west, along the Ionian coastline, that Persia would repeatedly encounter a people unwilling to submit quietly, the Greeks of Ionia. And it was in this region that the chain of events leading toward Salamis and toward Artemisia herself truly began. The Ionian coast of Anatolia, in modern-day western Turkey, was among the most dynamic cultural zones of the ancient world. Its cities, Miletus, Ephesus, and Halicarnassus, were wealthy, outward-looking, and intellectually alive. These were the environments that produced the earliest Greek philosophers, thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus, who began to ask not which gods controlled nature, but what underlying principles governed it. This shift toward rational inquiry would eventually form one of the foundations of Western intellectual tradition, and it did not begin in Athens or Sparta, but here on this contested shoreline. Although these cities were Greek in language, religion, and cultural identity, for much of the 6th century BC they existed under Persian rule. After Cyrus defeated Lydia, the Ionian cities were absorbed into the empire. They were governed by satraps, required to pay tribute, and expected to provide ships and soldiers when imperial campaigns demanded it. It was within this complex and unstable intersection of Persian authority and Greek identity that the story of Artemisia began to take shape. Some cities adapted to Persian rule, while others resisted it with growing frustration. The arrangement between conqueror and subject was never truly stable. At best, it was an uneasy compromise held together by necessity rather than loyalty. By 499 BC, that fragile balance finally broke. Across the Ionian coastline, a large-scale uprising known as the Ionian Revolt erupted against Persian authority. It spread quickly among the Greek cities of the region, but it was disorganized, poorly coordinated, and ultimately destined to fail. Even so, its consequences would reshape history far beyond its immediate collapse. Athens, a city from mainland Greece, had intervened by sending ships to assist the rebels. Those Athenian forces took part in the attack and burning of Sardis, the Persian administrative center in western Anatolia. When news of this reached King Darius, his reaction was said to be one of deep and lasting anger. According to tradition, he ordered a servant to remind him 3 times every day, "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether literal or symbolic, the message captured the intensity of Persian determination for revenge. Darius eventually acted on that fury. In 490 BC, he launched a military expedition against Greece. His fleet crossed the Aegean Sea, attacked and destroyed the island city of Eretria, and then made landfall at Marathon on the northeastern coast of Attica. What followed astonished both Persian commanders and the wider Greek world. The Athenians, fighting largely without allied support, confronted the invading force on the plain of Marathon and achieved a decisive victory. The Persian army retreated in disorder, and the event became immortalized as the Battle of Marathon, a defining moment in Greek historical memory. Although Darius had planned further retaliation, he died in 486 BC before he could carry out a second invasion. The responsibility of avenging the humiliation at Marathon, completing the subjugation of Greece, and extending Persian influence deeper into Europe passed to his successor and son, Xerxes. It would be Xerxes who assembled the vast invasion force that would ultimately bring Artemisia into the center of this historical storm. To understand Artemisia, we must first understand the city she ruled, Halicarnassus. Positioned at the southwestern edge of Anatolia, it sat beside a wide natural harbor opening onto the shimmering waters of the Aegean Sea. Geographically and culturally, it occupied a unique crossroads between the Greek island world to the west, the Persian administrative system to the east, and the Anatolian traditions rooted in the region itself. This made it a place of constant exchange, where identities blended rather than remained fixed. Halicarnassus was the capital of Caria, a region with its own distinct language, customs, and historical traditions. The Carians were not originally Greek, but centuries of contact had deeply influenced their culture. They adopted Greek religious practices alongside their native beliefs, used Greek as a language of trade and prestige, and formed marital and political ties with Greek communities. Over time, this created a society that was neither fully Greek nor entirely Anatolian, but a hybrid civilization shaped by both influences. This hybrid identity became a source of strength rather than confusion. A ruler of Halicarnassus could operate comfortably within multiple cultural systems at once, speaking the language of Greek diplomacy while also navigating the administrative expectations of the Persian Empire. This ability to move between worlds gave Carian rulers a strategic flexibility that purely Greek city-states or strictly Persian provinces often lacked. The ruling dynasty of Halicarnassus in the early 5th century BC embodied this blended identity. Artemisia's father, Xerxes, served as the dynast of the city. He was not a king in the traditional Greek sense, nor a satrap in the strict Persian administrative hierarchy, but rather a hereditary ruler who governed under Persian oversight while maintaining local authority and traditions. His position reflected the empire's flexible approach to governance in distant regions. When Xerxes died, his authority passed within the family line. Artemisia's mother, whose name has not survived in historical records, briefly held power after him. When she too passed away, leadership eventually transferred to Artemisia herself, likely around 490 BC. At that time, she was a young widow with a son, stepping into a role that required both political intelligence and military responsibility. She became the dynast of Halicarnassus and nearby islands such as Kos, Nisseros, and Kalymnos, ruling as the effective sovereign of a small but strategically significant part of the Persian Empire. Our knowledge of Artemisia comes almost entirely from a single ancient source, Herodotus of Halicarnassus. Later called the father of history by Cicero, Herodotus was born in the same city where Artemisia ruled, though several decades after her lifetime. He would have grown up hearing stories about her. He may have spoken with individuals who had known her personally or had heard account from those who did. His portrayal of her is therefore shaped by both proximity and tradition, though filtered through the assumptions of his own time. In Herodotus's writing, Artemisia appears as an unusual figure, someone who does not fit neatly into expected categories. He describes her with a sense of admiration mixed with surprise, almost as if he is documenting something exceptional. He notes that she joined Xerxes' naval expedition not out of obligation alone, but driven by her own courage and what he characterizes as a kind of bold, almost masculine spirit. That description is revealing, because in Greek cultural understanding, military skill and courage were traditionally seen as male traits. A woman exhibiting them was not just unusual, it was conceptually disruptive. Artemisia was also a widow, yet the identity of a husband is not preserved in any surviving historical record. This absence is itself meaningful, highlighting how easily women and their connections could be erased from historical memory, even when they held real political authority. We do not know how her marriage began, nor how it ended. What is clear, however, is that widowhood did not remove her from power. Instead, she assumed full control. Her authority as dynast was not symbolic or ceremonial. It came with real obligations, including the command of troops and the provision of naval forces to the Persian king. When Xerxes demanded support for his invasion of Greece, Artemisia fulfilled her duty personally, taking command of her own contingent. She did not send others in her place. She went herself. This detail also reveals something often overlooked in simplified accounts of Greek and Persian opposition. The Persian Empire, despite its hierarchical and imperial structure, was in some respects more flexible than the Greek city-states when it came to women in positions of authority. Persian royal and noble women could own property, manage estates, engage in political decision-making, and maintain dynastic power within established systems of inheritance. Within this framework, a ruling widow who successfully governed a territory and fulfilled military obligations was not an anomaly to be dismissed, but a functioning part of the imperial structure, regardless of gender. The Greek world, by contrast, was in many city-states deeply resistant to the public exercise of female authority. Athens is often remembered as a birthplace of democracy, yet it was a democracy defined strictly within limits. Women could not vote, could not speak in the assembly, could not hold public office, and were expected to remain largely within the domestic sphere. In such a cultural framework, the idea of Artemisia, a Greek-speaking ruler aligned with Persian power, exercising direct military command, would have been profoundly unsettling to an Athenian audience. She represented something that did not fit neatly into their categories, a living contradiction. And historically, contradictions are often where the most compelling narratives emerge. When Xerxes ascended the Persian throne in 486 BC, he inherited not only the vast empire of his predecessors but also the unresolved legacy of Marathon. Within the Persian court, opinions were divided about how to proceed with Greece. Some advisors urged restraint and consolidation. Others pushed for renewed expansion. Among the more influential voices was his cousin Mardonius, who argued that subduing Greece was both strategically feasible and essential for imperial prestige. Xerxes ultimately sided with a more aggressive faction. The decision was made. Persia would invade Greece once again, but this time not as a limited expedition. It would be a full-scale campaign of conquest. The empire mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Over several years, preparations were made across vast distances. Ancient sources, especially Herodotus, describe Xerxes' army in numbers reaching into the millions, though such figures are widely understood by modern historians to be exaggerations shaped by storytelling tradition rather than precise record-keeping. Even so, when reduced significantly, the scale of the force remains extraordinary, likely in the range of 150,000 to 300,000 soldiers, supported by a large and diverse naval fleet. The logistical planning alone reveals the seriousness of the undertaking. 2 massive pontoon bridges were constructed across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, allowing the army to cross without relying on ferries. Supply depots were established along the invasion route in advance, ensuring food and provisions for the advancing forces. Even engineering projects of remarkable ambition were undertaken, including the cutting of a canal through the Isthmus of Mount Athos, designed to prevent a repeat of earlier naval disasters caused by storms in the region. This was not a temporary raid or a hurried campaign. It was a carefully organized imperial mobilization of immense complexity. From across the empire, contingents were summoned to join the invasion force. Lydians and Phrygians from Anatolia marched alongside Egyptians and Phoenicians from the eastern Mediterranean. Ethiopians came from the southern reaches of the empire, Cypriot archers from the islands, Arab forces with camel units from desert regions, and many other groups representing the full geographic breadth of Persian dominion. The assembled army was, in a very real sense, a portrait of the known world under imperial control. Herodotus, who had a strong interest in such enumerations, preserved a famous catalogue of these forces. Among the commanders listed in this vast military assembly was the queen of Halicarnassus, Artemisia. She contributed 5 ships to Xerxes' naval force. In purely numerical terms, 5 ships out of a fleet that may have contained 600 or 700 seems insignificant. Yet in ancient naval warfare, numerical size alone did not determine importance. What mattered just as much, sometimes more, was experience, discipline, and the quality of leadership at sea. To understand what Artemisia brought to Xerxes' fleet, it is necessary to understand the nature of naval warfare in the classical Mediterranean. It was a form of combat fundamentally different from anything in the modern world, demanding precision, coordination, and intense physical endurance. The dominant warship of the era was the trireme. Its name comes from the Greek trias, meaning 3-rowed, referring to its 3 tiers of oars arranged vertically along the hull. One level sat closest to the waterline, another above it, and a third higher still. Hundreds of oarsmen worked in tightly synchronized motion, each positioned with extreme precision so that their oars would not collide. A typical trireme carried around 170 rowers, along with a small number of marines and sailors responsible for sails and navigation. The vessel itself was long, narrow, and designed for speed rather than stability. Its primary weapon was a bronze ram mounted at the bow just below the waterline, intended to pierce enemy hulls in combat. In battle, the objective was not prolonged engagement, but decisive impact. A skilled captain aimed to strike enemy ships at precise angles, disabling their oars or breaching their hulls, while simultaneously avoiding counterattacks. Victory depended on timing, coordination, and spatial awareness rather than brute force alone. This made naval warfare extraordinarily demanding. The difference between a well-trained crew and an inexperienced one was absolute. Rowers had to maintain perfect rhythm over long periods, respond instantly to commands, and adjust their motion in unison during complex maneuvers such as sudden turns or rapid reversals. The helmsman, meanwhile, needed near-instinctive judgment, reading the positions of multiple enemy vessels at once and identifying the briefest opportunity to strike or escape. Such expertise could not be acquired quickly. It required years of experience at sea. Phoenician cities such as Tyre and Sidon were renowned throughout the ancient world for their maritime skill. Greek island and coastal communities of the Aegean were similarly experienced, having developed strong naval traditions over generations of trade and warfare. Halicarnassus, positioned at a key intersection of Aegean and Anatolian maritime routes, was likewise shaped by long exposure to seafaring culture. Its sailors were not inexperienced land soldiers forced onto ships. They were mariners by training and tradition. Artemisia's fleet, therefore, was not merely a symbolic contribution. It was professionally capable and strategically valuable. Herodotus even notes that her ships were considered second only to those of the Phoenicians in terms of quality within Xerxes' entire navy. Coming from a Greek historian who was not inclined to praise Persian allies uncritically, that assessment is particularly significant. In this way, Artemisia entered the stage of the Greco-Persian War not as a marginal figure, but as a commander of proven competence within one of the most sophisticated naval forces of the ancient world. In the spring of 480 BC, Xerxes' massive army crossed the Hellespont and began its advance through Thrace and Macedonia, moving westward and southward like an unstoppable tide. Across the Greek world, the reaction was a mixture of fear, resistance, and uncertainty. The Greek city-states were not unified, and they never truly had been. That fragmentation was, in many ways, their defining trait. Even as Xerxes' forces pushed deeper into Europe, divisions within Greece remained clear. Argos chose not to join the resistance against Persia. Thebes, one of the major powers of central Greece, would later align itself with the Persian cause. Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in the western Mediterranean, was engaged in its own war with Carthage and sent no assistance. The coalition that did form to resist Persia consisted of roughly 30 city-states, led primarily by Athens and Sparta, surrounded by smaller allies. Yet this alliance was fragile from the beginning, held together more by necessity than trust. Deep suspicion and competing priorities ran through it. One of the central debates was strategic. Where should Greece make its stand, and how should it fight? The first major attempt to stop the Persian advance came at Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a narrow coastal pass in central Greece. There, King Leonidas of Sparta led a small Greek force to block Xerxes' army. The battle has become one of the most famous episodes in ancient history. Around 300 Spartans, supported by several thousand allied troops, held the pass for 3 days against a vastly larger Persian force. Eventually, however, they were outflanked after a local Greek revealed a mountain path to the Persian commanders, allowing them to surround the defenders. Thermopylae ended in military defeat, but it became a powerful moral symbol. It delayed the Persian advance and proved that Greek soldiers, when fighting in terrain suited to their tactics, could resist even the largest imperial army of the age. It also gave the Greek navy time to engage Persian forces in a series of inconclusive battles near Euboea. Most importantly, it transformed Leonidas into a lasting symbol of resistance. But with Thermopylae lost, central Greece lay exposed. The Persian army swept through Boeotia and descended into Attica. In September of 480 BC, it reached Athens. The city had already been evacuated on the advice of the Athenian strategist Themistocles. What remained was burned and destroyed, the temples on the Acropolis reduced to ruins. At that moment, the Persian Empire stood deep within the heart of the Greek world. The question was no longer whether Persia could reach Greece, but but whether it could secure final control. Everything now depended on the sea, where the Greek fleet had regrouped in the narrow waters of the Bay of Salamis, just off the Athenian coast. Before the battle, Xerxes convened a council of war aboard his flagship. He posed a simple question to his commanders. Should the Persian fleet engage the Greeks in the Straits of Salamis, or should they wait? The majority of his admirals urged immediate action. The Persian navy was larger. Athens had already been captured and burned. Morale was high, and the Greek fleet appeared trapped in confined waters. To most commanders, the opportunity seemed decisive. Then Artemisia spoke. Her advice, preserved by Herodotus, stands as one of the most striking moments in ancient historical narrative. She urged Xerxes not to engage at sea. She argued that his strategic objectives had already been largely achieved. Athens had fallen, Greek resistance was fractured, and time itself favored Persia. Why risk a naval battle in narrow waters that favored Greek maneuverability? Instead, she advised patience. Let the Greek alliance collapse under its own internal tensions. In essence, her argument was that restraint, not aggression, would secure victory. As Herodotus paraphrases her reasoning, if the king did not rush into battle at sea, but kept his forces secure and advanced cautiously, even toward the Peloponnese, he would ultimately accomplish everything he had set out to do. The Greeks, she suggested, could not sustain unity for long. It was a remarkably sophisticated assessment of the situation, and, in hindsight, it was strategically sound. The Greek alliance was already under immense strain. The Spartans favored withdrawing south and fortifying the Isthmus of Corinth. The Athenians, whose city had been destroyed, were fighting for the possibility of return and survival. Tensions within the coalition were real and growing. Xerxes thanked Artemisia for her counsel. Then he rejected it. He ordered the fleet to prepare for battle. According to Herodotus, many of the Persian commanders were angered by her intervention. Not only had she disagreed with the majority, but she had done so in a way that implicitly questioned their judgment. Pride and frustration circulated among the leadership. Artemisia, however, remained composed and proceeded to ready her ships. Across the strait, on the Greek side, the Athenian statesman Themistocles was executing a different kind of strategy altogether, one based not on force alone, but on deception, psychological pressure, and careful manipulation of enemy expectations. His actions would soon play a decisive role in shaping the outcome of one of the most important naval battles in ancient history. Themistocles had understood long before the battle that the Greeks could not defeat Persia in open water. The Persian fleet was too large and too experienced in broad naval operations. But in a narrow channel, where maneuverability mattered more than sheer numbers, where local knowledge of currents, winds, and coastline could decide the outcome, the balance could shift. The Straits of Salamis offered exactly such an environment. Tight waters, unpredictable currents, shifting winds, and broken geography shaped by islands and headlands that could disorient any commander unfamiliar with them. If the Persian fleet could be drawn into this confined space in sufficient numbers, and if the Greek ship struck at the precise moment, then Persia's numerical superiority could be neutralized. The challenge, however, was not strategy on paper, it was cohesion. The Greek alliance itself was fragile. Spartan commanders were already discussing withdrawal, and the unity of the fleet was at constant risk of collapse. Faced with this instability, Themistocles executed a move of extraordinary audacity. He sent a secret message to Xerxes, carried discreetly by a trusted slave, suggesting that the Greek fleet was preparing to flee. If the Persian king acted quickly, the message implied he could trap them in the strait and destroy them in one decisive blow. It was a deception. Xerxes believed it. He ordered his fleet to move at night and block the western exit of the straits, ensuring that no Greek ships could escape. In doing so, he unintentionally positioned his forces exactly where Themistocles wanted them, compressed into the narrow waters of Salamis, where their size became a disadvantage rather than an advantage. Whether Artemisia issued any warning at this stage, Herodotus does not say. Yet it is difficult to imagine that a commander of her experience did not recognize the danger. The formation of the fleet, the tightness of the waters, the limited space for maneuver, Each of these would have signaled risk to a seasoned naval leader. But Persian command structure required obedience. The decision had been made. The fleet moved into position, and in the gray light before dawn, the Battle of Salamis began. The exact unfolding of events cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Our primary source is Herodotus, writing decades later, supplemented by fragmentary references from other ancient authors, including Aeschylus, who may have witnessed the battle firsthand, and later summaries of lost historical works. What emerges is not a precise timeline, but a vivid picture of chaos, noise, destruction, and in the center of it, individual decisions that shaped survival and memory. As dawn broke, the Persian fleet entered the straits in extended formation, too wide and unwieldy for the confined waters. When the Greek fleet emerged in disciplined alignment, bronze prows catching the early light, the imbalance became immediately apparent. The Persians struggled to adjust. Ships from behind pressed forward into the front ranks, compressing the formation into confusion. The careful order required for effective naval warfare began to collapse under its own weight. The Greeks exploited this moment without hesitation. Their triremes struck at exposed flanks, ramming enemy vessels with precision, then reversing rapidly before counterattacks could form. The narrow strait became a compressed battlefield where movement itself turned into danger. Ships collided with ships, formations broke apart, and coordination dissolved into survival instinct. Timber cracked or shattered. Men were thrown into the sea. Burning vessels drifted uncontrollably into others, spreading fire across the crowded waters. The soundscape would have been overwhelming. Shouted commands, splintering wood, the rhythmic crash of collision, and the cries of drowning crews. Persian commanders attempted to restore order, pushing their ships forward to regain initiative, but every advance deepened the congestion. Retreat was equally impossible. The fleet had become trapped, not only by geography, but by its own mass. From a vantage point on the shore, Xerxes watched the unfolding disaster. He had brought scribes with him to record the names of commanders who distinguished themselves in victory. He expected success. Instead, he witnessed collapse. It is within this chaos that Artemisia's most famous episode occurs, and the most debated. Herodotus presents it with unusual dramatic weight. As the battle turned against Persia and confusion engulfed the straits, Artemisia found herself pursued by an Athenian trireme. The Greeks, according to tradition, had placed a bounty on her capture, an incentive for taking her alive. With the enemy closing in and escape routes vanishing in the congestion of battle, she made a decisive choice. She turned her ship and rammed a vessel from the allied Persian fleet. The ship she struck belonged to Demosthenes, ruler of Kolindos, an allied commander from the Chian coast. Whether there was prior hostility between them, whether she selected his ship deliberately, or whether it was simply the nearest viable target in a collapsing formation remains unknown. What is clear is the outcome. His ship was destroyed, and all aboard were lost. In the confusion of the moment, the pursuing Athenian captain witnessed the attack and misinterpreted it. Believing Artemisia had defected, or at least turned against the Persians, he abandoned pursuit and shifted his attention elsewhere. In the chaos of battle, where smoke, spray, and collapsing formations obscured identity, this misreading saved her. From Xerxes' vantage point above the strait, the action was visible. His attendants reportedly asked which commander had achieved the strike against the allied ship. When informed it was Artemisia, the king is said to have uttered a remark that has echoed through history. "My men have become women, and my women men." Whether admiration, frustration, or disbelief lay behind the words is impossible to know. What is certain is that in the midst of one of antiquity's most chaotic naval battles, Artemisia's decision ensured not only her survival, but her lasting place in historical memory. Xerxes is reported to have exclaimed, "And my women have become men." It is one of the most widely remembered phrases associated with the ancient world. It reflects the deeply gendered assumptions of the period, the king's frustration with the performance of many of his male commanders, and the paradoxical respect that Artemisia's actions provoked even amid a devastating defeat. The sailors from Kolindos who were aboard the ship she destroyed would have told a very different version of events. But those sailors did not survive to give their account. The witnesses to what might be called her betrayal, or her calculated survival, were lost beneath the waters of the Salamis Strait. In the end, history is preserved by those who remain. By the time the Battle of Salamis concluded, the Persian fleet had suffered a severe and irreversible defeat. Hundreds of ships were sunk, captured, or driven ashore. Thousands of men, Persian troops, Phoenician sailors, and allied contingents from across the empire, were dead in the strait or washed up along the coastline. The Greek fleet, fighting in familiar waters and exploiting the narrow geography to its advantage, had held firm. Xerxes had not lost the entire war. His land army remained intact, and supply routes were still functional. But strategically, the situation had shifted in a fundamental way. Without control of the sea, the Persian army in Greece could not be reliably supplied for a prolonged campaign deep in hostile territory. The momentum of invasion had stalled. A new council of war was convened. According to some accounts, Xerxes even considered launching another naval assault or forcing passage through the strait again through sheer numerical pressure, a desperate plan born either of ambition or frustration. Once more, Artemisia advised caution, and once again, she argued that restraint was the wiser course. This time, her advice aligned more closely with the emerging reality. And this time, Xerxes listened. He decided to withdraw the main Persian forces back toward Asia. A substantial army would remain in Greece under the command of Mardonius to continue the campaign the following year. But Xerxes himself, along with the core of the fleet, would return east across the Hellespont. Herodotus also records that Artemisia was entrusted with transporting some of Xerxes' sons, royal children who had accompanied the campaign, back safely to Ephesus. This detail is significant. Among all the commanders of the Persian navy, it was Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus, who was considered reliable enough to be responsible for the personal safety of the king's heirs during the retained voyage. Whatever else her role may have been, this was a mark of exceptional trust. The war did not end immediately after Salamis. Persian forces under Mardonius continued operations in Greece. The following year, 479 BC, would see decisive battles at Plataea and Mycale, which ultimately ended Persian military presence on the Greek mainland. But by then, Artemisia had already returned to Halicarnassus. Her active role in the invasion had come to an end. After this point, she fades from the historical record almost entirely. What became of her is uncertain. Later traditions suggest conflicting endings. Some claim she died in dramatic fashion, others that she ruled peacefully into old age. None of these accounts can be confirmed with confidence. As with much of her life, the final chapter is lost. To understand what Artemisia represents historically, it is necessary to step back from the narrative and consider the source that preserved her memory, Herodotus. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, born around 484 BC, likely a decade or more after the Battle of Salamis, spent much of his life traveling and collecting accounts of the ancient world. He visited Egypt, Babylonia, and regions around the Black Sea, interviewing priests, soldiers, and travelers. His work, Histories, meaning inquiries, became the foundation of Western historical writing. But Herodotus was not a modern historian in the contemporary sense. He was an investigator of stories as much as facts, gathering traditions, comparing versions, and evaluating them through observation and judgment. His work reflects both careful inquiry and the limitations of oral tradition. His account of Artemisia is shaped by proximity and familiarity. She was from his own city, part of the local historical memory in which he grew up. He portrays her with a mixture of admiration and astonishment. At times, she appears almost exceptional to him not only in skill, but in the very fact of her competence as a military commander. At the same time, Herodotus's narrative is filtered through the assumptions of his era. His surprise at Artemisia's role reflects broader Greek expectations about gender and warfare. She is not simply described as a commander, but as an unusual one, a figure who stands outside the expected norms. Even the famous episode of the ramming of the Allied ship is presented with caution. Herodotus does not claim certainty about Artemisia's motives. He openly acknowledges alternative possibilities, tactical necessity, personal enmity, or simple opportunism. That uncertainty is important. It suggests not propaganda or certainty, but the presence of multiple competing interpretations already circulating in his time. In that sense, Artemisia's story remains open-ended, not only because the historical record is incomplete, but because even the earliest surviving account refuses to fix a meaning in a single frame. That kind of epistemic honesty is one of the qualities that makes Herodotus exceptional. It also serves as a reminder that history is rarely as neat or settled as later retellings would like it to be. What we can say with reasonable confidence is straightforward. Artemisia was a real historical figure. She commanded ships in what was arguably the largest naval battle of the ancient Mediterranean world. She offered strategic counsel that, had it been followed, might have altered the course of the campaign. And she survived when many other commanders, on both sides, did not. Whatever the precise balance of intelligence, caution, and opportunism in her character, she was far from ordinary. Greek responses to Artemisia were complex, and that complexity itself is informative. On one level, she was simply an enemy commander. She fought on the Persian side during the sack of Athens and led ships against Greek forces at sea. In the uncompromising logic of ancient warfare that made her a legitimate target, someone to be defeated, captured if possible, killed if necessary. The Athenian bounty placed on her capture, 10,000 drachmas, was not admiration but recognition of threat. It signaled that she was considered a particularly dangerous opponent among Xerxes' commanders. Yet Greek culture also contained a long-standing tradition of acknowledging the worth of formidable enemies. Homer's Iliad, a foundational text of Greek identity, repeatedly presents adversaries as capable of honor, courage, and even moral depth. Hector, the defender of Troy, is portrayed with a dignity that often surpasses that of his Greek opponents. Within that cultural framework, Artemisia could be placed into a familiar category: the respected adversary, the enemy whose abilities demand recognition. She occupies that space in the Greek imagination as well. Had the Greeks faced her strategic advice being fully adopted by Xerxes, the outcome of the war might have been very different. That possibility alone gives her a kind of narrative weight that goes beyond simple opposition. Even in victory, the Greeks could not entirely dismiss the competence of those they defeated. At the same time, Greek reactions to Artemisia also reveal underlying anxieties about gender. In classical Athens, military valor and political authority were strongly coded as male domains. The civic identity of the city depended on a sharp division between public male life and private female life. A woman who crossed that boundary, who commanded ships, advised kings, and took part in major military decisions, was not merely unusual, but socially destabilizing in conceptual terms. Artemisia, however, existed safely outside Athenian society. That distance made her easier to acknowledge. She could be admired as a curiosity precisely because she did not belong within the Greek civic order. An Athenian woman acting in the same way would have represented a scandal or an impossibility. A foreign allied queen, however, could be placed into the category of remarkable exception without threatening the internal logic of Athenian social norms. One of the central questions modern historians and archaeologists continue to ask is how far Artemisia can be recovered beyond Herodotus. What material or documentary traces of her world still exist? The honest answer is limited. Ancient Halicarnassus lies beneath modern Bodrum in southwestern Turkey. Continuous habitation over centuries means that many classical layers are deeply buried or built over. One of the most famous monuments associated with the region, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, later built for Mausolus in the 4th century BC, has not survived intact. Its remains are scattered, reused in later construction, and preserved only in fragments across museums and archaeological collections. What archaeology does confirm, however, is the broader cultural and political environment described by Herodotus. Halicarnassus was a wealthy, cosmopolitan city deeply integrated into both Greek and Anatolian worlds. Excavated material reveals a blended cultural landscape: Greek-style pottery alongside local Chian artistic traditions, Persian administrative influences alongside Greek religious dedications. This hybrid material culture closely matches the kind of society that would produce a figure like Artemisia, someone able to operate within multiple political and cultural systems simultaneously. The maritime infrastructure of the region also supports Herodotus' general picture. Harbor installations and rock-cut ship sheds in the Bodrum area indicate a city with significant naval capacity. While there is no direct evidence linking these facilities specifically to Artemisia's fleet, they demonstrate that the region possessed the physical and logistical foundations for sustained naval operations. Epigraphic evidence from Caria further reinforces the idea of dynastic rule that included significant roles for women. While Artemisia herself is not directly named in surviving inscriptions, later figures from the same cultural milieu, including female rulers in related dynasties, suggest that female authority was not structurally impossible in this regional context. Carian political culture appears to have allowed greater flexibility in dynastic succession than was typical in many Greek city-states. Taken together, this suggests that Artemisia was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader pattern in Carian governance where female rulers could and did exercise real authority. Within the larger narrative of Western history, the Battle of Salamis is often treated as a decisive turning point, the moment when Greek independence was preserved and the trajectory of later European intellectual and political traditions was secured. That interpretation is not incorrect, but it is incomplete. Salamis was not only a story of what was preserved, it was also a story of who was present and what their presence reveals about the complexity of the ancient world. Artemisia's role in the battle disrupts simplified assumptions about gender, power, and cultural boundaries in antiquity. Greek civilization, often associated with democracy, philosophy, and civic rationalism, also maintained strict exclusions, particularly regarding women's participation in public life. Against that backdrop, Artemisia stands as more than an exception. She is evidence that ancient systems were more varied, more flexible, and more internally inconsistent than later idealized narratives suggest. Women exercised power in the ancient world, but they did so through the structures that were available to them: dynastic succession, royal courts, temple economies, and property systems that often granted elite women more practical influence than formal political institutions acknowledged. Artemisia operated within those structures with unusual effectiveness. She was not a feminist in any modern sense, nor was she advancing a principle of gender equality. She was acting to secure her own authority, her kingdom, and her survival within the competitive world of imperial politics. Yet in doing so, she exposed something that later historical narratives often struggled to fully integrate: that strategic intelligence, command ability, and military leadership are not inherently tied to gender. The Persian king himself is reported to have recognized this in strikingly blunt terms when he exclaimed, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." The phrase was meant as both criticism and admiration, an expression of frustration at his commanders and reluctant recognition of Artemisia's effectiveness. What that image leaves behind is powerful. A woman navigating one of the most chaotic naval battles of antiquity and surviving when many better positioned or more heavily supported commanders did not. It is an image that has not remained fixed in the past, but continues to be reinterpreted in every age that returns to the story of Salamis. The 19th century, shaped by nationalism and imperial rivalry, often framed Salamis as a foundational clash between East and West. The 20th century, marked by global war and the collapse of empires, tended to read it through the lens of overreach, resistance, and the limits of imperial power. The 21st century, more attentive to marginalized voices and historical absence, increasingly approaches it as a story about memory itself, about who is recorded and who is not. Artemisia survives in that record, but imperfectly. She appears in Herodotus and in a handful of later traditions as a figure of unusual prominence. Yet surrounding her are countless others whose names are lost entirely. The wives and daughters of Persian officials managing estates in their husbands' absence. The women of Greek cities watching fleets depart from harbors, uncertain whether they would return. The enslaved women who moved through camps and ships on both sides of the conflict, leaving almost no trace in the written record. History is always selective. It is shaped by proximity to power, by literacy, by chance, and by the survival of texts. Artemisia had Herodotus. That alone makes her unusual in the context of the ancient world. But her survival in the record is not merely luck. It is also the result of actions that demanded to be noticed, commanding ships in a major naval battle, advising an emperor, and surviving a catastrophe that destroyed far larger and more famous forces. The tension between what her world expected of her and what she actually did is part of what makes her historically visible at all. Over time, Artemisia has been repeatedly reinterpreted. In some traditions, she appears as a warning figure, used to reinforce boundaries about gender and authority. In others, she becomes a symbol of exceptional female capability in a male-dominated world. In modern popular culture, she is often reimagined through contemporary concerns about representation and empowerment. These versions are frequently anachronistic in detail, projecting modern ideas backward onto an ancient context that would not have recognized them. Yet even if these reinterpretations are historically imprecise, they reflect something genuine: the enduring human interest in figures who disrupt expectations, who operate successfully within systems that were not designed to accommodate them, and who force later generations to rethink the limits of those systems. The Battle of Salamis itself lasted only a single day. By midday, its outcome was already effectively decided. What followed was not prolonged engagement but collapse. Ships grounded, burning wreckage drifting across the straits, bodies carried by tide and current. The largest naval force the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen was broken in confined waters. In the years that followed, the consequences of Salamis unfolded gradually. Athens entered its so-called Golden Age, producing monumental architecture, drama, philosophy, and political experimentation that would profoundly shape later European thought. Its naval power, strengthened by the victory, became the basis of an Athenian maritime empire through the Delian League, an alliance that increasingly functioned as a system of tribute and control over other Greek cities. Meanwhile, Persia remained a dominant imperial force. It did not collapse or retreat permanently. Persian diplomacy, wealth, and political strategy continued to shape Greek affairs for generations, influencing conflicts between city-states and eventually regaining formal control over the Ionian cities through later treaties such as the Peace of Antalcidas in 387 BC. In that sense, Salamis was not a final resolution. It did not end the struggle between Greece and Persia, but it did mark a turning point where the outcome of that struggle ceased to be predetermined. For the first time, Persian expansion into Greece was not simply advancing, it was uncertain. And within that uncertainty, figures like Artemisia stand out not as marginal curiosities, but as participants fully embedded in the decisive moments of the ancient world, acting, deciding, surviving, and leaving behind traces that still shape how that world is understood today. Before Salamis, the conquest of Greece appeared from the Persian perspective to be only a matter of time and logistics. After Salamis, it became difficult, and then, over time, increasingly unrealistic. Artemisia had perceived this shift even before the battle. In her counsel to Xerxes, she understood that Persian power was not limitless, that Greek resistance would harden rather than collapse, and that the narrow waters of Salamis were not the right place to risk an imperial fleet. Her advice was ultimately ignored. The battle was lost, and yet she emerged from it intact. Her ships survived, her standing was not diminished, and her relationship with the Persian king remained secure. In a world as harsh and unforgiving as the ancient Mediterranean, survival itself is a form of intelligence. Artemisia survived Salamis. She survived the Persian defeat that followed. She survived the long-return journey across dangerous waters. And in a deeper sense, she survived into history itself. Her existence was preserved through Herodotus' account, carried forward by centuries of manuscript copying, scholarly interpretation, translation, and debate. In that sense, her most remarkable achievement is not a single tactical decision, nor her participation in council, nor even the episode of the rammed ship. It is simply that her name endured. The Straits of Salamis are calm now. Ferries move between Piraeus and Salamis in less than an hour. Swimmers and small fishing boats cross waters once filled with triremes locked in deadly collision. Athens stretches across the horizon, its modern lights replacing the camps and ships of Xerxes' army. The ancient world has faded. Its languages survive in academic study, its gods in textbooks, its monuments as archaeological sites visited by millions who often pass without learning the names of the people who built or shaped them. Yet some names endure. They endure because they were attached to actions powerful enough to be recorded. They endure because written words, once copied into tradition, become remarkably resistant to disappearance. And they endure because each generation finds new meaning in them and chooses, in its own way, to carry them forward. Artemisia of Halicarnassus was a queen. She was a naval commander. She was a strategist who saw clearly where others saw only certainty. She was a survivor who made decisions under extreme pressure. And she was a woman exercising authority in a world that did not formally reserve such authority for women, yet still, in practice, sometimes allowed it. She is neither myth nor symbol. She was a historical person, complex, pragmatic, intelligent, and at times ruthless. Her loyalty lay both with her own survival and with the Persian king who valued her judgment. She was shaped by the unique cultural crossroads of Korea, and in turn she helped shape the events that later generations would remember as decisive. In a world dominated by kings and generals, she navigated a narrower and more dangerous path, moving between powers, reading situations quickly, and acting when it mattered. Not by standing outside the system, but by understanding it more clearly than most of those who held higher formal rank within it. Her sea did not keep her. Her story crossed it, and more than 2.5 millennia later, we are still telling it. History is not only the record of emperors and great battles. It is also the record of individuals who, through intelligence, courage, and the ability to act under pressure, created space for themselves in systems not designed for them. Artemisia stood at Salamis outnumbered, pursued, and surrounded by larger forces, and she endured. Not through chance alone, but through judgment, timing, and an unflinching ability to adapt in real time. If her story brings the ancient world closer, more human, more immediate, then it has already done what such stories have always done best. It has survived by continuing to matter.